Okay, so I've stepped in to this session, so apologies to any of you who were here really hoping to hear about the integration of students with Asperger's syndrome. But what I thought I'd do is just run you through very quickly a session that I delivered a couple of weeks ago with academic staff. So this is the slides that I used for a 2-hour session, development session, to try and persuade academic staff to move forward with their thinking around developing inclusive learning and teaching. And I've called it Challenging Assumptions, Barriers to Inclusion, because we've heard a lot about strategies to get things in at high level in the institution, to work right across the sector, and those things are fantastic, and I'm absolutely behind them. But there's been quite a lot already. There's been quite a lot of guidelines, toolkits. There's loads of stuff within institutions. Like I was saying the other day, it still doesn't seem to shift. It doesn't necessarily seem to shift the academics themselves in the classroom, changing their practice, teaching differently. And I believe firmly in getting them to own it. We've talked about it being something that hasn't happened yet. We've also talked about it being something that is ongoing. What's inclusive in your classroom tomorrow might not be the same thing as it's inclusive 2 weeks' time or next year with a different cohort. You might have to focus in a slightly different way. So in other words, you have to really understand inclusion yourself and own it and move it forward all the time. So this is what I'm trying to do with academic staff. So I start by saying, let's have a learning contract. Now in our institution, the learning contract is the piece of paper or the electronic document that goes out from the Disabled Student Support Service to tell the academics what reasonable adjustments the student's been recommended with. So I'm saying, I'm just using that word to try and make the connection, but I'm saying let's have a learning contract with us. We're not going to talk about learning contracts in this session, because the first thing that nearly always happens is you get somebody saying, but I've got this student, and you end up in this diverted conversation which you can't really answer because it depends on the circumstances and so on and so on and so on. And they're trying to get you to unpick the recommendations for a student you've never met and why it's impossible for them to facilitate it. So I just say, let's have no learning contract discussions. Let's make sure we move on. But I say, let's have an uninhibited discussion where don't get tangled up in worrying about language that's correct or incorrect, because otherwise we might not ever get to say the things we really need to say. So try and get a safe one. I tell them that it's about questions, asking me questions, and I also say right at the outset, listen, I'm not going to tell you what you have to do. In the end, it's your decisions and your outcomes. I'm not going to tell you anything. In fact, I refuse to tell them any kind of actual changes that they might make, okay? I can do that. I don't always do that, but I sometimes do. So then I give them a bit of evidence. So this was specifically for a group of staff who had some feedback around differential outcomes for particular groups. So they were actually aware that their teaching wasn't inclusive because there were differences between how successful certain a group of disabled students were versus non-disabled students. So they were keen to change. So I give them some evidence. We've heard this before. It's a slide I used yesterday. I'm trying to explain to them at this point why it is that despite the endless support for inclusive practice, things still aren't changing. And I'm introducing the idea that there's differences in how people understand and perceive inclusion. And that leads me on to giving them a session now where they're going to spend 5 or 10 minutes in their groups talking about what they think inclusion means, and then getting that discussion going. So then we'll then have a good, healthy discussion trying to define inclusion and getting them to think of different answers. Because quite often people see inclusion as widening participation. They don't see it as, once you've got the students in the room, you still need to do more. They still think of it's about widening participation, getting different people in, but then once they're there, you can still do something differentially. So we have that discussion. I then give them this definition, which comes from Hawkins, 2010. These slides, obviously, you haven't got yet, because, I wasn't going to be doing this, but I will. Dara's got them, so I'm sure they'll go out and get posted. So you can have a look at this and the references at the end. So pedagogy, curriculum and assessment are designed and delivered to engage students in learning that is meaningful, relevant and accessible to all. Okay. So it's very wide-ranging, but what I'm able to get to with the staff then is, can we agree that inclusive practice is just good teaching practice? Because, you know, it's a cliche and it's been trotted out for years, but actually it's true. I actually firmly believe it's true. It's just good teaching practice. And we usually get to the point, yeah, I think we can agree that. That's the definition. Can we also agree that because it's good teaching practice, actually that's what we're all aiming to do? We all aim to create an inclusive environment for our students. And again, I can get some buy-in mostly from people for that. So I've now got them saying, yeah, it's good teaching practice, and I'm trying to do it. I've got yeses from them. But I also want to give them a little bit of an out. But I think this is true. Full inclusion is aspirational and not achievable. That yet is an ongoing process and will remain an ongoing process. And we needn't beat ourselves up if we're looking into our classroom and finding that we're not actually fully inclusive. You know, we have to accept that that's likely. But then I want to get into something a little bit more meaty with them. I want to start them really reflecting on where these barriers come from. And quite a few of these barriers are completely hidden barriers. So I remind them that higher education is actually, by intention, discriminatory. Well, it certainly is in the UK anyway. And I mean with a small d. We don't accept everyone into higher education. They have to achieve academically. They have to meet certain standards. So it is by intention discriminatory. And at the end of the day, we're going to give some people first, some people 2-1s, some people 2-2s, some people thirds. We're going to discriminate on their achievement level. So there is a level of discrimination that goes on, a genuine and acceptable discrimination. But there are things called academic standards. There are things called competency standards. There are things called professional body standards. And there's also this kind of concept that people carry around with them in their heads, and people in, you know, not just academics, all of us, of what it means to be a graduate. What's important about being a graduate? What are the skills that graduates are supposed to come out of higher education with? And I want them to think about this. And I want you to just have a quick think about this. So could I ask you to use your enabled devices and just Google Kahoot. So Kahoot is there spelt. So type Kahoot into your search engine. What will come up is a big coloured screen with a little box that says PIN number. I will give you the PIN number in a second when I remember how I'm supposed to do this. It helps if I have my glasses on. Sorry? Yeah, thank you. I told you somebody would close it down. It was on here before. I preloaded it. Okay. It's not there. Let's see if it's here. Yes, there it is. Okay. So I'm showing you this because it really is a simple tool. This is I'd never used Kahoot before, and I got on it, and within an hour I'd created these 3 things, and I was able to use it in the next session. So in just a second you'll get the number that you need. Once you've typed that number in and hit enter. So here's your how'd you get the sound off? So type that number in and hit return, and then type in a nickname for yourself. Which F is going to get rid of sound? That one. Oh, sorry, we're enjoying that. I was just about to top myself. Okay, so 23 players. Is anyone desperately waiting to get on? Oh, 24, good. That's quite good. Okay, we're ready to start. I can't see how many people there are in the room. Does anyone want me to wait a few seconds more while they're waiting to load up? No? Okay, let's go. So what time is it? 12:47. Okay. So I want you to look at this question, and then I'll give you the possible answers. Do you believe the ability to spell correctly should be a competency standard for higher education students? In red or triangle is yes, absolutely, no doubt. I agree with that. Blue, hit blue if you think yes, to a certain extent. That's a diamond. Circle or the yellow, I think possibly, but it's not that important. Or a square, green, no, it's not a competency standard, definitely. Okay, so red, triangle, yes, absolutely, no doubt. Blue, diamond, yes, to a certain extent. Circle, yellow, possibly, it's not that important. Green, square, no, it's not a competency standard at all. Okay, we're nearly there. You have 12 seconds left. We'll come on to that discussion in just a second. Okay, let's see what you all said. Okay, so look at that variety. So 1, yes, it absolutely is. 9, yes, it is to a certain extent. 4, possibly it's not that important. But 10, no, it's just definitely not a competency standard. And the interesting thing is that this is reflected in academic staff as well. And it's also reflected, this kind of range, maybe a few more say absolutely no doubt, but this kind of range is reflected not just amongst academics generally, but in the same subject area. Okay? So if you have that kind of perception, if you have that feeling about what it is to be a graduate, but you're not aware of it, then what happens when you're marking someone's work and it's poorly spelled? Whether or not you have a specific 10% that's there nominally for spelling, etc., etc., etc. So I have conversations with staff where some people say if it's badly spelled, you know, that they'll never be able to get ahead in their profession. It's unprofessional and they need to be professional. So, you know, I'm going to take that 10% off if they can't spell correctly. And then I've got other people, same course, saying, no, it doesn't bother me at all. I don't think it's that important. They can always use a spell checker. And when we get to the critical point, we'll make sure that they do it. So you have this wide variety. This is just hidden disadvantage for some students. It's completely hidden. And when you start thinking about these things, so of course I do have another one of these, which I won't go into, but somebody hinted at it earlier. I said, do you believe the ability to produce correctly spelled materials is important or is a competency standard in higher education? That changes the picture somewhat. Because it's also quite tricky, this question. You know, the ability to spell is not the same as the ability to produce a document that's well spelled. Not in this day and age. So when people are saying poor spelling, do they mean, oh, twice they wrote A-D-N instead of A-N-D? But 36 times they'll spell and all right. You know, is that poor spelling? Or is that just typos? So are you actually penalising typos, or are you, you know, what is it you're actually assessing here? So what I'm trying to do in that moment is just get them to start reflecting on the kinds of biases and assumptions that they're making about what it is to be a student. Nothing to do with the learning outcomes. And I might remind them also that how many times do they assess this particular ability? So how many times are they actually penalising students over the course of their written assignments through 3 years at university? Other learning outcomes only assessed once. Done that, great, move on. They can do that. But they'll assess this one over and over and over and over and over again. So if somebody struggles with spelling, they're going to get penalised over again, over and over again. Does anyone want to comment? Okay, so the question was, does it vary across different subject areas? Maybe a professional body indicates that this is a competency standard that must be met. And my answer is that, did you want to answer it, Atif?
No, I was going to answer it.
Okay, my answer to that is, yes, it can vary. I don't mind if it's explicit and it's outlined and it's clear what it is they're assessing. But clearly what it is they're assessing, is it spelling, or is it the ability to be professional in what you've produced? Challenge the professional body, because there's a whole myth out there that somehow, if the professional body says it, you've got to do it. Not true. The professional bodies very often aren't aware of what they're really stipulating, and once they're made aware of it, they will change it and go, oh, no, I didn't mean that. I just meant X, Y, or Z. So that's quite a good question to have come up in a discussion with staff, is that then you can talk them through those different options. What were you going to say, Atif? Here, do you want the microphone?
I mean, I guess the largest thing is that the challenge remains for all universities. In a way, the job of undoing, and unlearning, because every child in the UK effectively is measured on two things. When our children go to school, they are measured on just two things, whether their literacy skills and their working memory. And on that basis, they've then got to navigate through the workplace and university. And then when we get to the dimensions where we're having fairly radical conversations about the attributes of what these things mean, they come with psychological impacts of how do I unlock that? How do I then feel I have sanction to really pass my degree, knowing that there's been strange allowances or they're not normal allowances? And those are challenges that come with a culture shift. But I suspect for them to be really effective, they're going to happen at school level way before they get to university.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, but we can't necessarily affect that, but we can affect at least the fairness of what we do in higher education, I think. And we can force academic staff, or I can try and make academic staff really reflect on what biases they hold within them. So we haven't got a long left. I go on to then raise Pauline Hainsworth's work, which I think is really worth a look at. She did a lot of work for the HEA. She thinks there are two very important practical things that you need to think about. Interrogating disciplinary norms, teach to nurture student belonging and engagement, interact with diversity through learning and teaching, encouraging and practice self-reflection. So I'm not trying to give the lecture now, you understand. So I then I do go into more depth for each one of those 4 bullet points. And here you see disciplinary language challenged, but again, it's about challenging assumptions, nurturing student belonging and engagement. We've got the co-creators and co-producers of the learning experience going on here, which I do think is really important. Making sure you use a range of images and diversity within your source materials. We've all heard of the white curriculum, for example. And then encouraging practice and self-reflection, which is really what I'm trying to do. So I'm using this now as part of the evidence. How do we reflect on our own biases? And I like this little case study. It's something that I had quite a few years ago within social work in our institution. This tutor said this to me. A level 5 student on a social work degree discloses that they have a diagnosed phobia of red doors. They can't go near them. And the tutor tells them that they won't be able to go on placement nor become a social worker, since home visits are a core part of the social worker role, and it would be impossible if they couldn't go into some place that had a red door every time they arrived and they saw a red door, couldn't go in it. How could they be a social worker? It's a fitness to practice issue. Is the tutor correct? And I get them to discuss that. And they usually get there in the end. So what I ended up saying to this tutor was almost straight away was, well, would you expect somebody in a wheelchair couldn't be a social worker? And they went, oh, no, of course somebody would. Oh, it dawned. Of course, quite often people in wheelchairs can't get through doors for a variety of reasons because they're up steps or whatever it means. But it didn't mean they couldn't be a social worker. So there was something going on mentally which is part of the kind of unconscious bias against mental health. and phobia and the difficulties that that might create. So again, it gets them thinking about the kinds of biases they might have going on. And then I go on to this unconscious bias thing, which is about the way in which people teach. I'm not going to go through the whole story, but you'll get the references to look at this. It's absolutely outrageous research which would never be allowed. It's incredibly unethical, but it happened in the 60s. It happened. It's been done. Nothing I can do about that now. The outcomes are quite interesting because what it showed was that if teachers have certain expectations of their pupils or their students, if they think they're going to do well, they teach them more warmly, and those students do better. Which is, and then I asked the group of staff, I said, how many of you treat your students like fellow professionals and adults, and how many of you treat your students, like extended school pupils? How many times do you have conversations within which there is students going on, in your common rooms or your offices? How biased are you against students? And I teach on the PG Cert, so I have academic staff coming in to learn how to be teachers. So they're students, but they're also academic teaching staff. And they come in late. They get on their phones, they have to leave to go to the loo in the middle of the session and come back. They do all that, but then they complain about students doing it. And I say, well, didn't you realise that 4 people came in late today? Nobody worried. Nobody was bothered. It didn't interrupt the session. You just assumed that there was a professional reason for being late. You just assumed that they're a professional person, they're a tutor in higher education, they would have a reason for being late. If they need to leave the room or get on the phone, there's a reason for it. But you don't do that with your students. You assume they're being lazy, unprofessional, just students. So I'm really forcing them to get to think about their own unconscious biases. I do have another Kahoot, which I'm not going to go into now because we only have a couple of minutes, but that's getting them to think about biases again. I remind them about these 4 pillars or they're not pillars, but 4 major points that Pauline talked about. And then I give them a template and I say, right, I want you, for the last 15 minutes, I'd like you to write down 1 or 2 changes that you're going to make in your classroom. Or it might be on your course, or it might be on your program, and it might take a long time, or it might be something really simple. But just write it down and say what resources you need, or if there are any barriers to it, and give it in to me, and I'll then deal with it and send it back to them. And if they need support, we can provide that support. But I try and monitor that change then. So I'll get back to them in about 6 months and find out, did you make that change? Was it successful? Or maybe I'll wait a year because it was something they were going to put through revalidation. And I'll talk to them about whether they made that change and what the impact was, whether it worked or whether it didn't work. And if it didn't work, or if it couldn't be done, genuinely why? Not why not, but genuinely, what stopped you from doing it? Is there a way in which we can, reinstate that by removing whatever barrier it was? So this is relatively new in my thinking, in the way in which it's evolved over a lot of time from previously giving people lots of examples of case studies of good practice that they might do, and then having to deal with the objections that they come to because I couldn't do that in my area. So I'm now trying this out. So I'm not going to pretend that this is the answer, that this is the only way to do it, or any of those things. I have no idea whether it's going to really make significant difference in the institution. But I just thought it'd be useful for you to see, an example of what an education developer is trying to do with academic staff in our institution to try and get them to take on change and effectively do what I was talking about before yesterday, produce this ripple effect, but in numerous different places at lots of different times, because it's culture change that we need to make. Yes, it's change, but it's culture change. And that culture is not just about teaching practice, it's about assumptions that people make about higher education, what standards are, what standards are. Yeah, I've said it. There we go. That's it. Lecture over. Any questions? Yes.
Yeah, Paddy. Again, very thought-provoking. I must say, it gets you thinking very quickly. The only question, most of the discussion is about barriers. But is there not the other side of the coin, actually motivating people as well, and what the motivators for people as well? Because all of the discussion is about barriers and eliminating barriers.
Yes, thank you. That's a good question, because actually a year and a half ago, it was, if I'd done this a year and a half ago, I would have been saying to you, I've given up trying to tell people what to do, I'm just motivating them to do it. So I think, I think maybe you've caught me in a particular phase, and next time I need to feed the motivation back in. So I think that's a good point. I think that's I'm really thank you for actually giving me that, because I perhaps lost sight of the motivational aspect and got excited and focused too much on the barriers part of it. So thank you. Helpful. Did anyone else sort of feel that as a matter of interest?
Wanted to ask you about,
yeah.
The attitudes, particularly at a higher level. Michael Fulham talks about, bringing in practices, new materials, but it's attitudinal change is so difficult within education. That yes, you can do all that, but what has the response been to your work within your own educational?
Well, I think what I've got fed up with in the past is having a very good response to the session. Like, evaluate that session. Oh, yes, that was a great session, Paddy. Thank you very much. Really thought-provoking. It's made me really think about it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I don't actually know whether anything's ever changed or not. So I've had lots of good feedback on, yeah, good stuff, nice, I enjoyed it, but nothing about it. And so this is why I'm trying to, we're all being told we have to show impact. I'm a central provision. So as far as the faculties are concerned, I'm a cost. They bring in the income, they bring in the student fees, that's their budget. The centre is paid for by top slicing the money that they bring into the institution. So if there's time for to penny pinch, then they turn the focus on us. What have you ever done for us? What's the impact of your area? Why are we paying for you? So we have to provide impact. So that's why I'm trying now to actually get kind of written declarations from people. Like, yeah, I'm going to make a change. I'm not asking them to make massive changes, any change, but just to get that feedback. But I haven't got far enough down that line to be able to say I've got all this impact evidence now. So I don't know. The answer is I don't know if it's going to work.
Just a thought, maybe just to share, but maybe part of the issues around these are sometimes about obviously retention, which costs universities money, and you're keeping, if you keep the retention figures in, then you're paying your bills, more than, I'm sure. These things are all, often we look at the retention, we talk about the students and the student choice and the participation, but rarely we get engaged with the resilience of students in a long-term way. Sometimes students, they come in, they become ambassadors, it's a one-year dynamic. Sometimes students can be used to sign off policies that are pretty awful, but it's been done because we managed to galvanize that student. What we don't do is really build a legacy around making sure students have a long-term voice within the structures. And obviously universities have their alumni bodies, which are important, but we have yet to really galvanize a culture shift that says the resilience of students getting to the participation standards has a commodity. It's a powerful one, and it's that same commodity that will keep students talking to each other, and it will keep them talking to you. And those where the culture shifts can perhaps be part of embedding in a long-term way, rather than just the one-year sign-offs. But it's just a thought.
Thank you. Okay, I think we've well overrun our time, but I'm more than happy to carry on the conversations over lunch.